The director yelled "cut" for the 7th time, frustration bleeding through his voice. Brigitte Bardot stood frozen in the middle of the set, her co-star's arms still around her waist, his face inches from hers. The scene required a kiss, a simple, passionate kiss that the script described in 2 words. They embrace. Simple for anyone else. Impossible for her. "Brigitte, what's wrong?" The director approached, his patience visibly thinning. "It's just a kiss. You've done hundreds of them." She had. And every single one felt like drowning. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Can we take 5 minutes?" The crew sighed collectively. The co-star released her and walked away, annoyed. The director waved his hand dismissively. Brigitte retreated to her dressing room, locked the door, and sat on the floor with her back against the wall, trying to remember how to breathe. The world called her a sex symbol, but the truth was, Brigitte Bardot was absolutely terrified of love. It started when she was 15 years old. Paris, 1949. Brigitte was a ballet student at the Conservatoire, graceful, disciplined, innocent, in the way only sheltered girls from upper-middle-class families can be. She knew nothing about men, about desire, about the predatory nature that hides behind compliments. She knew nothing about Paul. He was 32, a photographer who'd been hired to take promotional photos of the ballet students for a magazine feature. He had kind eyes and an easy smile. He told Brigitte she had extraordinary potential and a face the camera loves. She believed him. Why wouldn't she? "Would you be interested in doing a private session?" he asked after the group shoot. "Just some headshots for your portfolio. No charge. I'd love to help you." She said yes. Her mother said yes. Everyone said yes. Because he seemed professional, safe, trustworthy. He was none of those things. The session was at his studio, a small, cramped space above a bookshop. Brigitte arrived in a simple dress, her hair pulled back, nervous but excited. For the first hour, everything seemed normal. He took photos. She smiled. He gave directions. She followed them. Then he asked her to loosen up a bit, to let the straps fall, to show a little more skin. She hesitated. "It's art," he assured her, his voice smooth and practiced. "This is how all the great actresses start. Trust me." She was 15. She didn't know she could say no. The session lasted 3 hours. With each request, he pushed further, and Brigitte, conditioned from years of ballet to follow instructions without question, complied until she felt like her skin was on fire with shame. When it was over, he handed her an envelope with the photos and said, "You're going to be a star, but remember, this is our secret. Artists understand each other." She walked home in a daze. That night, she locked herself in the bathroom and scrubbed her skin until it was raw, trying to wash off the feeling of his gaze. She never told anyone, but her body remembered, and it learned to associate intimacy with violation. 2 years later, when Roger Vadim pursued her romantically, Brigitte was still carrying that trauma like a stone in her chest. Vadim was handsome, charming, sophisticated. He quoted poetry and talked about film and made her feel seen, not as a body, but as a person, or so she thought. Their first kiss happened in the rain, outside a cafe in Montparnasse. Brigitte's heart pounded with terror disguised as excitement. When his lips touched hers, she felt nothing but panic, a screaming voice in her head that said, "Danger, danger, danger." But she pushed through it. Because this was what normal girls did. Normal girls fell in love. Normal girls didn't freeze up when touched. So she pretended. She became an actress before she ever stood in front of a camera. She learned to mimic desire, to make the right sounds, to move her body in ways that suggested passion, while feeling absolutely nothing except the desperate need for it to be over. Vadim never noticed, or if he did, he didn't care. Because what he wanted wasn't Brigitte's genuine desire. He wanted her performance of it. Their wedding night, in December 1952, was a disaster. Brigitte never spoke about publicly. Years later, she would write in a private journal entry that was discovered after her death. I lay there like a corpse and prayed for it to end. He thought I was shy. I thought I was broken. We were both wrong. I was traumatized, and he was using me. The pattern continued throughout their marriage. Vadim would initiate intimacy. Brigitte would dissociate, her mind leaving her body, floating somewhere near the ceiling while the physical act happened to someone who looked like her but wasn't her. She became expert at faking, at pretending, at protecting the fragile male ego by performing pleasure she didn't feel. And then came, and God created woman. The film that made Brigitte Bardot an international sex symbol was also the thing that cemented her terror of intimacy. Because suddenly, she wasn't just performing desire for one man in private, she was performing it for millions of strangers in public. The famous dance scene, the one that scandalized conservative France and made her a global icon, required Brigitte to move her body in explicitly sexual ways, while men watched and filmed and directed and controlled every gesture. She was 21 years old, and she was being forced to embody raw sexuality while internally screaming with discomfort. More sensual, Vadim would instruct. Touch yourself more. Make them want you. She did what he said, because by then she'd learned that her wants, her comfort, her boundaries didn't matter. What mattered was the product, the image, the fantasy. The world saw a confident, sexual woman. Brigitte felt like a trained animal performing tricks. After the film's release, something inside her broke completely. Men on the street started approaching her with the confidence of ownership. Strangers grabbed at her in public, believing the character she'd played was who she actually was. During a promotional tour in Italy, a man cornered her in a hotel hallway and tried to kiss her, saying, "Come on, you do it in the movies. Why not in real life?" She had to be rescued by hotel security. But the worst part wasn't the strangers. It was the men who claimed to love her. Every relationship followed the same pattern. They pursued her aggressively, attracted to Brigitte Bardot, the symbol. And when they got close enough to touch her, she'd freeze, panic, shut down. They'd get angry, confused, accusatory. "You're Brigitte Bardot," they'd say. "How can you be afraid of this?" Because Brigitte Bardot, the sex symbol, and Brigitte, the traumatized woman, were two different people trapped in the same body. Her second husband, Jacques Charrier, tried harder than most to understand. He noticed how she'd tense when he touched her unexpectedly, how she needed lights off and silence, how afterward she'd immediately shower, scrubbing her skin the same way she had at 15. "Talk to me," he'd beg. "Tell me what's wrong." But how could she explain? How could she tell him that every touch felt like a threat, that her body had learned to equate intimacy with danger, that she couldn't separate affection from violation because no one had ever shown her the difference? She tried once. Late one night, after too much wine loosened her defenses. "Something happened when I was young," she whispered. "A photographer. He made me do things." Jacques went silent. Then how young? 15. He should have held her. Should have told her it wasn't her fault. Should have understood that she'd been carrying this wound alone for years. Instead, he said, "That was a long time ago. You need to get over it." Brigitte never spoke about it again. Not to him. Not to anyone. Their marriage lasted 18 months. He left, frustrated by her frigidity, never understanding that what he perceived as coldness was actually trauma armor. By the early 1960s, Brigitte had developed elaborate coping mechanisms. She only engaged in intimacy when drunk or medicated, when she could numb herself enough to endure it. She chose partners who were emotionally distant, because emotional connection made the physical aspect even more terrifying. She cultivated a reputation for being promiscuous, taking lovers and discarding them quickly. The tabloids called her insatiable. The truth was, she couldn't bear to be with anyone long enough for them to realize she was faking everything. Better to be seen as wild and free than exposed as broken and afraid. A makeup artist who worked with her throughout this period later recalled men would come to set to visit her, and I'd watch her face change. Like she was putting on a mask, she'd become this other person, sultry, playful, sexual. But the second they left, the mask would drop, and she'd look exhausted, scared. The famous sex scene in Contempt with Michael Piccoli required 43 takes because Brigitte kept freezing mid-scene. The director, Jean-Luc Godard, thought she was being difficult. She was having a panic attack. The breaking point came in 1963, during the filming of a particularly intimate scene. The script required her to lie in bed with her co-star, their bodies intertwined, whispering dialogue about desire and passion. Simple for most actresses, impossible for Brigitte. She made it through the first few takes by dissociating, letting her mind drift away while her body performed. But on the fifth take, something snapped. She was midline when suddenly she couldn't breathe, couldn't move, couldn't pretend anymore. She pushed her co-star away violently and ran off set, hyperventilating, tears streaming down her face. The production shut down for 2 days, while the studio figured out how to handle their sex symbol, having a complete breakdown during a sex scene. The irony was savage. The woman the world believed embodied sexuality couldn't even film a fake intimate moment without falling apart. Brigitte saw a psychiatrist for the first time that week. Not by choice. The studio insisted. They needed their investment functional. The doctor listened to her describe her symptoms. The panic, the dissociation, the inability to feel safe with physical touch. Then he said something that changed everything. You're not broken, you're traumatized. What happened to you at 15 wasn't your fault, and your fear isn't weakness. It's your body trying to protect you. It was the first time anyone had validated her experience. The first time someone had told her she wasn't crazy or frigid or defective. She cried for 3 hours straight. Years of held-back grief pouring out. But understanding her trauma didn't make it disappear. Brigitte continued to struggle with intimacy for the rest of her life. She had relationships, marriages, affairs, but none of them felt safe. None of them allowed her to experience the passion and connection the world assumed came naturally to her. In a 1968 interview with a female journalist she trusted, Brigitte came close to admitting the truth. People think because I've played certain roles, because of how I look, that I must be very experienced with love, very comfortable with desire. She paused, choosing her words carefully. But the truth is, I've spent my entire life terrified of the thing I'm supposed to represent. I'm a symbol of something I've never actually felt. The journalist, sensing dangerous territory, changed the subject. The confession never made it to print. Some truths are too uncomfortable for public consumption. Brigitte's terror of intimacy extended beyond the physical. She was equally terrified of emotional vulnerability, of letting anyone see past the carefully constructed facade, of admitting need, or fear, or pain. Because every time she'd been vulnerable, with the photographer at 15, with Vadim, with Jacques, with directors and co-stars and lovers, it had been used against her, exploited, weaponized. So she learned to keep everyone at arm's length, to be charming but unavailable, desired but untouchable. Friends from her later years described her as warm but unreachable, someone you could spend hours with and still feel like you'd never really met her. She had this way of talking about intimate things, love, sex, relationships, with complete detachment. One friend recalled, like she was discussing someone else's life, like she'd never actually experienced any of it herself, because in many ways, she hadn't. Not really. Not safely. The saddest part was watching the world continue to sexualize her even as she retreated from sexuality entirely. In her 40s, after retirement, Brigitte stopped engaging in romantic relationships altogether. She dedicated herself to animal rights activism and surrounded herself with rescued creatures who needed care but not intimacy. "Animals are easier," she told a rare interviewer in 1978. "They don't expect performance. They don't want something from me I can't give. They just want safety and food and kindness that I can provide." But the media still published sexualized photos from her past, still discussed her body, her beauty, her appeal, still reduced her to an object of desire decades after she'd stopped playing that role. A tabloid ran a "Where Is She Now?" piece in 1985, featuring old pinup photos alongside recent paparazzi shots of her gardening in old clothes. The headline, "From Sex Kitten to Cat Lady." The cruelty was breathtaking, as if a woman's only value was her sexual availability, as if retiring from performance was tragedy rather than survival. Brigitte cut the article out and kept it in a drawer, a reminder of why she'd been right to walk away. In her 70s, Brigitte finally found a form of peace, not through romantic love that remained elusive and frightening, but through self-acceptance, through understanding that she'd spent her entire youth being used and exploited, and that her fear wasn't weakness but wisdom. A journalist who interviewed her in 2001 asked if she had any regrets. Brigitte thought for a long moment. "I regret that I believed them when they told me I was frigid, that I was broken, that there was something wrong with me for not enjoying what they wanted from me. And now? Now I understand that I wasn't the problem. They were, all of them. The photographer who violated me, the husband who used me, the industry that sold me, the world that consumed me. They created the problem and then blamed me for it. Do you believe in love now?" She smiled sadly. "I believe in safety. I believe in kindness. I believe in respect. If that's love, then yes. But the thing they call love, the thing that requires surrender and vulnerability and trust, no. I learned too young that those things are dangerous." The world called Brigitte Bardot a sex symbol, but she was terrified of love, and she spent her entire life paying the price for trauma that was never her fault, while the world judged her for the symptoms of that trauma. She was exploited at 15, used by her husband, sold by an industry, and consumed by millions who never once asked if she was okay. And when she finally found the courage to walk away from all of it, to choose safety over performance, solitude over violation, animals over people who wanted pieces of her, they called her bitter, reclusive, difficult. They never called her what she actually was, a survivor. Brigitte Bardot died, knowing she'd never experienced the passionate love affairs the world assumed defined her life. But she also died knowing she'd survived, that she'd protected herself when no one else would, that she'd chosen her own safety over the world's expectations. And in the end, maybe that was the bravest act of all.